Logging into Oracle Apex with Jmeter can be tricky and requires us to gain a basic familiarity with the particular mechanics of the Apex login process. This video is not an introduction to Jmeter nor to Apex. That being said, this video does not assume a high degree of familiarity with either. Let's get right into it. After downloading Jmeter 5.1.1, you can see I have navigated to the binary folder. I use the Mac command for launching the program because I'm on a Mac. We have several options for creating a Jmeter script to programmatically log into Apex. For this demo, we're going to build it using Jmeter's recording utility. I begin as in any Jmeter project by adding a thread group. To this thread group, I then add a recording controller, which I pair with an HTTPS test script recorder. I then simply click Start to begin the recording session. Notice that by default, the recording is listening on port 8888. I receive a pop-up with instructions to import a newly created certificate into my browser. Using Firefox, which I recommend, I navigate to Network Settings and enable the manual proxy configuration to operate on port 8888. I then navigate to Certificates, where I can import the Jmeter certificate. As you can see, I have previously done this step. Returning to my other Firefox tab, I refresh my login page and proceed to log in. Back in my Jmeter GUI, I can see that the recording controller has created a ton of content, so I'll go ahead and end the recording. Reviewing the content that Jmeter recorded, I know from experience that most of this is not pertinent to the mechanics of logging in. It's a lot of GET requests for CSS and JavaScript files. I can confidently remove all but 3 of the recorded HTTP requests. As a matter of good practice, I'll save my project. My next step is to add an HTTP cookie manager because, as should be no surprise, Apex uses cookies for its authentication logic. Now is a good time to take a second to talk about the mechanics of the Apex authentication process. The top line news is that Apex requires a lot more than simply your username and password to authenticate your session. It further requires a series of time-sensitive authentication tokens. The full list of these tokens may change from one Apex version to the next, and may also be responsive to the particulars of your authentication scheme. You can easily confirm which are necessary for you by consulting the HTTP post request made to the www_flow.accept address. My demo, which should be representative, requires that I provide Apex with a valid session ID or instance ID, a page submission ID, a page items protected ID, and my username and password, of course. Those last two are hidden in the p_JSON field. All in all, we need a minimum of 3 HTTP requests, 2 GETs, and 1 POST to execute an Apex login with Jmeter. The first request is a GET request against a public login page with no session ID in the URL. This page contains within it all of the time-sensitive authentication tokens necessary for login. The second request is a POST request to www_flow.accept, in which we send all of this content plus our username and password to the authentication procedure. And finally, the third request is a GET request to an arbitrary page in the application to validate that you're successfully logged in. In review, we need more than our username and password to authenticate ourselves. We further need to supply a valid session ID, a page submission ID, and a page items protected ID. Resuming our tutorial, our next exercise will be to extract the authentication tokens we need from our first HTTP GET request. I right-click on the first request and select a JSR223 post processor. Before I forget, I'll add a listener. I favor the view results tree, which I will demo shortly. Back in my post processor for the first request, I specify that I will use JavaScript. Into the script field, I copy and paste a script that I've adapted for my purpose from my GitHub repo, link in show notes. This script scans the page source of the login page for all the requisite tokens and makes them available for me to use as variables. Moving on to edit our post request, I replace all the hard-coded authentication tokens from our recording with our newly created variables from my script. Note that the variable syntax in Jmeter is to bookend the variable identifier with $open curly Q bracket on one end and close curly Q bracket on the other. I pass in p_instance and p_page_submission_ID. For the p_JSON field, I copy and paste its hard-coded contents into my code editor and sub in my variables for p page items protected and p page submission ID for a second time. And finally, moving on to our third HTTP request, I edit the URL to include the p_instance variable to replace the existing hard-coded session ID. Now we are ready to test our code. I navigate to our View Results Tree listener and click Play and observe that all three requests are displayed with green checkmarks. I confirm that it successfully logged me in by examining the response body of the response data of our final HTTP request, which clearly displays the HTML of our homepage. If you were not successful, I want to call out that this request response data is invaluable for debugging. For example, if you were to examine the response body of your login page, you can locate the necessary authentication tokens and validate that they match up with the values you are passing into your post request. This concludes my simple demo of programmatically logging into Apex using Jmeter. Please see my show notes for helpful links and extra detail.